I'm Molly Bernard, and many, many years ago I started a small private school in South Bend, which became known as Stanley Clark School. Stanley Clark School came into being at a critical point, not only in my life, but in a certain sense in the life of the nation. In the beginning, it was the Mary Reed Cleland School, named for my grandmother, who was not only an outstanding first-grade teacher in her native Scotland at the turn of the 20th century, but a social reformer and activist in London, Ontario, Canada, during World War I. It is strange to face this group of people, and I was talking at the time to a group of parents late on in the history of the school, this group of people, some of whom I know, but more I don't, and realize that my school, as I like to think of it, sprang from another age, another set of needs quite foreign to most of you. It was born in the post-World War II era, at the end of a decade very unlike any this group of parents can, for the most part, even imagine. I don't remember it very clearly myself, partially because it was a long time ago, and partially because the 1950s were traumatic years for my family. We had lost 3 children. First, a beautiful baby boy who was drowned in a pond in my parents' garden. Then our first daughter at age 7, and 3 years later, our only other son, age 9. Both of a strange blood problem, doctors linked to X-rays routinely performed at their premature births. Babies kept coming after these, all healthy, all little girls. 3 of them during my years in the school. Eventually, we had 7 daughters, all of them graduates of Stanley Clark School. The name of the school was changed by the board in 1965 to encourage donations from local citizens. It's given the name of a local notable individual. So why did we take on this project in the first place? A non-denominational private elementary school in a community where none had existed within anyone's memory. Partly, I suppose, because our surviving children were the focus of our lives, and we wanted for them things that the culture of the times and the community in which we were living could not give. The parochial schools, which as Catholics we would have been expected to choose, were unbelievably crowded. 60 youngsters with 1 nun in the first grade of the new St. Anthony's School. We lived in Madison Public School District, which was fairly well regarded, and we sent our children there. Mary Louise, whose birthday was in March, started kindergarten at mid-year, a few weeks before turning 5. A year later, in first grade, she took to reading like a duck to water. We plied her with all the children's classics I had loved back in the early 30s, and she'd sit curled up on a corner of the sofa, plowing through one book after the other. We didn't own a TV in those days. The bedtime story read by Mother or Daddy was a high point in the day for both Mary Louise and Paul. Peggy was a little young for the books we chose, but usually we took a quick dip into a nursery tale on her behalf. Paul was slower than Mary Louise at reading on his own. He was in first grade when his older sister died, but in second grade he discovered Squanto and the Pilgrims and became committed to books from there on. The fall of '56, we set out on a lengthy motor trip to visit relatives in Canada, then drove across New York State to the big city, where friends of mine lived in and operated a fashionable Catholic elementary school on East 89th Street. This was St. David's School, where in the mid-'60s, John Kennedy started his education after his father, the president, had been shot. His mother took him out of St. David's after a year because the school wanted him to repeat kindergarten. I was captivated by our visit to St. David's. I had never seen such a school. I immediately began to think, why couldn't we have a school like this in South Bend? The classes were small, the teaching so personal, the curriculum so rich. Even the kindergartners were learning French. The reading texts in first grade were an English series to which my friend David Hume, the headmaster, introduced me. They didn't remotely resemble the American Scott Forsman staple, See Dick, See Jane, See Sally, See Spot Run. Old Lob and the barnyard creatures in the English Ginn's reader had personality and adventures. Ginn's basic reading method was phonetic, which had been abandoned in most American schools back in the mid-'30s. Some of the more backward parochial schools, like St. Adalbert's on the west side of South Bend, continued to use the phonetic method with outstanding results, despite a largely immigrant student body. American primary education in the mid to late '50s was at a low ebb, geared to the lowest common denominator. Most parents accepted that, and those who didn't enriched their children's lives with literature and extracurricular activities at home, thereby creating a situation in which school itself was often seen as boring. Few mothers, at least in my circle, had jobs of their own at the time. Shortly thereafter, Russia launched Sputnik, the first effort at space exploration. The suspicion began to arise in the United States that among the nations of the world, we might not be the leader in all intellectual and scientific endeavors. Did American education leave something to be desired? At night we watched the skies and occasionally saw Sputnik passing overhead. It gave us an eerie feeling. In 1958, there was a change in the admissions policy at the South Bend schools. No longer would there be a February admission to kindergarten or first grade for youngsters whose birthdays fell between September 1st and March. Our bright little Anne, who was 5, December 15th, 1957, could not enter kindergarten until the fall of '58. Although she was already beginning to read on her own. If only we had a private school like St. David's, my husband and I moaned. Little by little, I began to entertain the notion we could start one. I summoned the courage to call a sorority sister of mine, who was the supervisor of student teachers at St. Mary's College. I asked her if she knew of any trained teachers, housewives like myself, who might be interested in part-time teaching kindergarten and first grade in a private school. She gave me 2 names, I called them straightway Peggy Emery and Barbara Everly. They were as excited as I at the idea of teaching again and doing it on their own. They came over a night or two later, and we spent an exciting evening dreaming of the ideal primary school that we would launch. Amazingly, launch it we did. That was March. By September, we had purchased an old house for $8,000, remodeled it up to a point, hired friends to teach art and music. I attended a new summer school program at Notre Dame on methods of teaching French in the elementary school, ordered books and materials, including the Old Lob reading series that David Hume had recommended, cleared the procedural aspects of our operation with various government authorities, then advertised for and recruited 15 first graders, all but one underage for the public school, as well as 14 kindergartners. It was to be a school tailored to the needs of individual children, a school rich in a combination of cultures, a school adventurous in exploring new avenues of thought, a school in which parents like ourselves would have genuine input. One of the first of such parents was a professor at Notre Dame, Bob Weinstock, who introduced me to the newly founded Council for Basic Education. This was a parents group out of California, parents and educators alarmed at the discrepancy between American public education and that of Europe. I subscribed immediately to their monthly bulletin, which gave me a solid basis on which to sell the school. Bob Weinstock not only enrolled his own not quite 6-year-old son in our school, but offered a scholarship for another child. I think we multiplied the scholarship with thin air and split it about 5 ways. There were at least that many offspring of Notre Dame junior professors and graduate students to whom our $300 annual tuition fee seemed enormous. Bob had a colleague on sabbatical in Europe, due to return in February, who would most certainly want to enroll his underage first grader. This was Ernest Eliel of the Notre Dame Chemistry Department, who became a most vital support to our venture over the years and ultimately a Cleveland trustee. These two good Jewish families and their fellow religionists, Barney and Sue Leviton, came on board so enthusiastically and with such an abundance of ideas and talent that we set aside any notion we might have had to give the school our own particular religious direction. At the same time, we could not, in good conscience, exclude all spiritual elements. We spoke boldly of fostering Judeo-Christian traditions, which led to some delightful and educative Hanukkah Christmas programs over the years. From the start, it was not just the children who gathered at the school. The high points the first year were the monthly parents' meetings, for which almost everyone turned out to discuss the bulletins from the Council of Basic Education and the progress their youngsters were making. There were a few complaints. Mostly everyone was excited and full of opinions. We had 5 teachers for our 29 children. Peggy and Barb taught 3 hours in the morning, 5 days a week, for $2,500 each. Liz Cullity, a good friend who had taught music in the public schools, came twice a week for music classes. A neighbor of mine who had graduated from art school did art projects with both groups, and I attempted to acquaint everyone with simple French phrases and singing games. In February, after a month-long illness, our son Paul died in the Children's Hospital in Chicago. What are we going to do with that little school? My husband sobbed as we drove through the early morning light along the lakefront. I suppose I was silent for a bit, and then I murmured, "We'll keep going. It'll be our salvation." In a sense, it was. It demanded our attention, and perhaps the normal response would have been to give up in despair. Instead, we moved ahead, one foot in front of the other, making plans for another year, even as we prepared for the birth in May of another daughter. She should have been a boy, but she wasn't. Still, a new baby brings her own comfort. There was momentary excitement toward the end of the first year. In fact, the week the baby was born, when I received word that Lillian Studebaker was about to sell her house on Jefferson Avenue and wondered if we would be interested in it for the school. I made an immediate appointment and ended up spending a delightful afternoon with Mrs. Studebaker as she showed me her lovely house and dreamed with me of how it might become a school. But at the end of the visit, we looked out her living room window at the E.M. Morris mansion next door, and both agreed Mrs. Morris would be unlikely to want an elementary school in her side yard. Besides, how would we ever raise the money? I went home and had my baby that night, 2 weeks early. We really never discussed the Studebaker house again. At that point, it was just unrealistic. But 2 years later, Mrs. Studebaker graciously agreed to serve on the school board we were putting together. The second year of the school was, I believe, our one financial triumph. We actually operated in the black, despite adding a joint second and third grade. In large measure, that was due to Ruth Groover, who for a number of years had directed South Bend's most popular nursery school. She decided she was tired of doing this on her own. She heard our kindergarten teacher was resigning because she was pregnant, and Ruth offered to bring her large and devoted following to the Cleveland kindergarten. That was a great coup. Without any effort, we had a full class of kindergarten pupils and a master teacher at the helm. In the meantime, we found a large part of the initial first grade was prepared to stick with us for a second year. Peggy Emery wanted to continue with her first grade children. We decided to put her in charge of a combined second and third grade, which worked out beautifully because our second graders were pretty much on a level with the third grade children who transferred in from the public schools. My memories of the second year are very sketchy, except that Father Hesburgh recommended Cleveland to a young family joining the Notre Dame Law School faculty that fall. Harris and Claire Wofford had a 7-year-old daughter. Harris Wofford, the new law professor, was an associate of Hubert Humphrey. They all came from Minnesota. Father Hesburgh was unsuccessful in securing Harris on a permanent basis for the Notre Dame Law School. His heart was in politics, and I believe eventually he was governor of Pennsylvania. But his daughter Suzanne enrolled in and flourished in our second grade for that year. The class was tucked upstairs in one of 2 attic bedrooms in that cramped little house. My 6'4" husband, who did the remodeling for the classrooms, couldn't even stand upright except in the middle of the room. In addition to preparing the classroom, my husband and my maid's husband, I had to have a maid at home to take care of my babies while I went about the business of the school, erected a great outside staircase or fire escape. The inside stair was very narrow, virtually spiral and would never have passed inspection. This, too, despite all the physical limitations of our building, was a very successful academic year. Having completed the equivalent of the public school third grade social studies in first grade, to Peggy Emery's great delight, she introduced now history and geography. French continued as part of the curriculum, with a new teacher in second and third grade, one who really spoke the language, and of course there was much reading and writing. Looking back on all I have learned since about primary education, I wonder why every child in our first two classes learned to read without any difficulty. By March of the first year, when we tested the first grade with standardized tests, all were above grade level, the median being third grade and several over the top at fourth grade 6 months. The following year, we did have a second grader who transferred in. His father was with ROTC at Notre Dame. The parents were at their wits' end because, bright as the boy apparently was, he could not read. It was the first time I ever heard the word dyslexia. I don't think we were able to help him. None of us had ever heard of the problem, which is so common today. I have to ask, is this a problem born of our television age, or was it widespread and simply unrecognized earlier on? The third year of the school brought many changes, beginning with the need for a much larger building. We had 60 children applying. In the winter of '60, we noted that a turn-of-the-century residence on Jefferson Avenue, which for many years had served as the Moose Lodge, was being vacated. Dirty and run down as it was, I don't think the Moose were strong on housekeeping or even essential repairs. Size-wise, it was perfect for us. Downstairs we would have kindergarten, first and second grades, a huge dining room which could serve as a gymnasium auditorium, and a gracious center entrance hall. Somewhere we also tucked an administrative office. On the second floor, big erstwhile bedrooms provided space not only for third and fourth grades, but a fifth grade, which we were determined to add this year. At last, our oldest child, Peggy, would be part of the family school. For the first 2 years, she had been the odd one out. Our realtor parent, Dick Measle, arranged for us to lease the Moose Lodge for a year. We had a more permanent arrangement in mind for the future, the Fish Estate, which for a number of years served as the provincial house for the Holy Cross nuns. The property was being purchased by the congregation of the First Christian Church, but it would be a number of years before they would do anything with it. In the meantime, it could possibly be leased. The move to the Moose Lodge not only significantly increased our enrollment, our expenses, and gave a new direction to our overall project, it made it clear to the community that we had bigger things in mind. We would ultimately be a real school offering 8 grades and kindergarten. Now was the time to turn to the National Association of Independent Schools for standards and advice. We signed up, and I attended their national meeting in New York in March of 1960. This enabled me to consult again with my old friends, the Humes. Early in that third year, in 1960-61, now ensconced in our new quarters, we put together a board of directors and became officially organized as a not-for-profit institution. These aspects of the school are pretty much put in the hands of my husband. I was much more interested in what went on in the classrooms. To enhance that aspect, we established an advisory council made up of friends on the Notre Dame faculty. Most of them didn't do much, but their names gave us weight. Actually, Arnold Ross, head of the Notre Dame math department, did see the school as a place to try out some new theories on the teaching of mathematics to elementary school children. It was a revolution which didn't actually succeed, despite several TV appearances a year or so later with Arnold and our children. Most of our ventures, however, were almost uniformly good. The enrollment continued to increase by leaps and bounds, our children to learn and test well above the norm at every grade level. We hired a Notre Dame student to provide physical education, particularly for the boys. We added ballet dancing for the girls one day a week, taking advantage of the large dining room in the Moose Lodge. We also started a school orchestra, conducted by a Notre Dame professor of instrumental music. There was one sad setback that year. Ruth Groover, our beloved kindergarten teacher, had to resign in January. She was found to have cancer. But the gods continued to smile on us. I received a phone call from a young woman from my hometown, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She had just moved to South Bend with her salesman husband. It turned out she was a well-trained and experienced kindergarten teacher and would love a half-day job even at our low salary level. It was this sort of incredible luck that confirmed me in my conviction that Cleveland School was meant to be and to thrive. Plans to lease the Fish Estate in the 4th year of the school continued apace thanks to Dick Measle. It was just as well. I will never forget the day I drove up after lunch at the Moose Lodge and discovered a fire engine in the yard, children lined up at the foot of my husband's handsome fire escape. It seems the ancient boiler in the basement, probably more than 50 years old, had overheated and triggered the fire alarm downtown. Fortunately, that was near the end of the heating season. When we exited the Moose Lodge that June, the house was torn down to make room for the new Teachers Credit Union. We have wonderful photographs of the students and faculty taken on the porch of the Fish Estate in June of 1961. That is, the students and faculty anticipating the move from the Moose Lodge. We really felt we had arrived, just having our pictures taken there. The summer was spent with a variety of workmen, mostly amateurs, preparing that beautiful old house for the arrival of the Cleveland School. The arrangement was that the ground floor should house kindergarten and a new preschool, something we hadn't had before. The 1st grade would occupy the Fish dining room. Into the handsome library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on all sides and an elegant fireplace, the Bernards would move our living room furniture, providing a comfortable reception room during school hours and a family parlor when school was not in progress. The 2nd floor would provide large classrooms, many with their own toilet facilities. For grades 2 up, a centrally located library and ample office space. The attic, which undoubtedly was the servants' quarters in the time of the Fish family, boasted 7 large if basic bedrooms. My husband, Leon, would claim one for his study. The rest made family bedrooms. In every respect, the fine old house, built, I believe, about 1880 for a Studebaker daughter who married a governor or lieutenant governor of New Jersey, lent itself perfectly to the school. It was in immaculate condition, as only a house full of nuns would keep it. In the Fish Estate, the school truly came into its own. Its most striking interior architectural feature was the wide central staircase, 2 stories high, with the magnificent window above the large midpoint landing. Here at Christmas, the first year, our current music teacher, we had a different one every year until Ty Gates joined us in the 5th year of the school, placed the student body for their concert. Helene DeSantis was a hard taskmistress. Youth was no excuse for sloppy performance. I've never heard children sing as those children did, filling the old house with clear young voices that made the rafters ring. One of those magic moments one would hope to take to the grave. The stairs were only one lovely feature of the building. There was a spectacular living room, perhaps 20 by 40 feet, maybe larger. It made a perfect kindergarten room with lots of space for active indoor play during the long Indiana winters. One of our first purchases back in the early days of the school had been large wooden kindergarten blocks. I don't remember if we added to them now, but I know that my own daughters, well above kindergarten age, loves to invite friends to stay after school and play with those blocks. There were 4 fireplaces on the main floor. One in the library, over the mantel of which hung the portrait of my 6 little girls, painted at a bargain rate by the mother of one of our students. She saw it as a worthy advertisement for her talents, and I believe she did secure several contracts as a result. There was a fireplace, of course, in the living room kindergarten, and in the adjacent den, which we used for the kindergarten reading. The 4th fireplace was a feature of the long reception room to the left of the front door. Here were the tables for our new preschool, another area of growth. The dining room and butler's pantry housed the 1st grade and its equipment. Across the back of the house was the large kitchen and servants' dining room, which the Bernards claimed as our own. We moved the school into the Fish Estate the summer of '62, with a number of issues not fully resolved. There were still vacancies in the faculty. Leon, my husband, and Junior, the husband of my maid, were hard at work building a fire escape, which had to run along the porch roof from one end of the 2nd floor to the other. The 3rd fire escape the 2 of them had built in as many years, only this time far more extensive. The classrooms needed blackboards, of course, and there was furniture to be ordered. But I really don't remember any of the physical details about that. Filling the vacancies on the faculty was an annual chore. I relied heavily on the Notre Dame community, friends, graduate students, occasionally, as this year, a senior professor. Our friend Robert Caponegri would inaugurate the 6th grade Latin program in return for tuition for his son Robin in grade 3 and Lisa in the preschool. Professor Caponegri was a very prominent Notre Dame philosophy professor and a good friend of ours. He was also interested in promoting grade school Latin. The summer weeks were going by, and I still had no teacher for the 2nd grade. I was working on the screened porch at the front of the house when a tall, blonde young woman walked up the drive. Someone had told her about this new school. Would we, by any chance, need a teacher in the lower grades? Her name was Wendy Zimmerman. Her husband would be a graduate student at Notre Dame in the fall, and she needed a job. She was a trained primary teacher. We chatted for quite a while about her credentials and my philosophy. Before the morning was out, we had come to an agreement. She was wonderful. The problem was that graduate students' wives don't last very long. Wendy moved on at the end of that year. But the same scenario occurred the following summer. This time it was Nancy Heminger who was looking for a job. It's a toss-up as to which young woman was the better second-grade teacher. I shan't take you through all the adventures of those 5 years as we learned about elementary education and brought to reality what was clearly a remarkable institution. Robin has raised the question, or he did to me when we spoke of this evening's event, as to how the school has fulfilled our expectations. Let me say first that I'm not sure what our expectations were, certainly not in the beginning. I will be frank to say that we had a vision of what it means to be well educated, possibly rather an old-fashioned vision by today's standards. First, it means to be literate, that is, to have read widely and to be able to express oneself well, both in writing and in speaking. I'll admit I shudder with horror at the distortion of language which I hear from my grandchildren, some of whom have attended this school. But it doesn't bother their parents when every third word is like, so I guess I'll have to trust they'll outgrow it. They don't do it in writing. I'm very proud to have seen through the years many examples of good writing coming from Clark graduates, in some cases remarkable writing. Clark is, after all, only an elementary school. What should an elementary school provide? Primarily, of course, tools for further learning and an intellectual appetite. I worry about the books my grandchildren are reading or not reading. That's the problem of TV. I worry even more about their preoccupation with self and their contemporaries. But that, I suppose, is characteristic of early adolescence. The message they draw from the culture is so me-oriented and so materialistic. When my daughters graduated from 8th grade at Clark School, I made their dresses out of a few yards of white-dotted Swiss. When I attended my granddaughter's graduation from Clark this past June, the little girls appeared as though clad for the debutante ball. I can't blame the school or its administration for any of this. It's how things are. But I wonder how much is due to the fact that it costs an awful lot of money to attend and graduate from Clark. And even people who don't have the money feel they must pretend that they do. Would it be unforgivable and step on too many toes if the school policies resisted certain aspects of contemporary culture? Certainly, I believe in competitive wages for teachers. I'm glad the buildings and grounds are beautiful. I just wish these things could be accomplished without our children reveling in materialism. Of course, the problem is bigger than Clark, much bigger. How do we communicate to the young that wealth is not a birthright, but a responsibility to be used for the good of all? Learning is a privilege. A good mind is a gift, but also a responsibility. The world is a marvelous place, full of exciting ideas and experiences. All of these ideas are difficult to communicate through the morass of advertising and TV to which the youngsters and their parents, for that matter, are exposed. I am fascinated these days by the whole concept of time and space, of the origins of things, the Mars probe, for example. Probably grade school science doesn't even touch on that, but it would be exciting to try. My point is, today as yesterday, when the Cleveland School began, an endless and exciting search for knowledge continues. Could we tackle values head on? Maybe some teachers at Clark do, but parents and children alike resist. A good school, even for young children, should be adventurous and challenging at every level. Education has its pragmatic aspects, but they should never be more than a means to an exciting future. I am 80 years old, but at times I think I've learned more in the last 10 years than all the 70 that preceded them, just by opening and reading books, listening to people and ideas. That is the lifelong habit of learning for which a good elementary school should prepare us.